Have you ever finished a long gaming session, or closed a social media app after scrolling for an hour, and looked up at the room around you, only to feel a sudden heavy sense of flatness, as if the color has been drained out of the world, and everything in front of you, the furniture, the window, the silence, feels overwhelmingly dull? It is a strange and unsettling feeling, one that many people describe not quite as sadness and not quite as fatigue, but rather as a distinct lack of flavor, a sense that the volume of reality has been turned down to a whisper. And for a few moments or even a few hours, nothing in the real world seems worth doing because nothing feels like it matters. Welcome and thank you for being here. Because if you have felt this way, you are certainly not the only one. And it is not because there is something broken within you, nor does it mean that your real life has actually lost its value, but rather you might be experiencing a very natural biological reaction to a very modern phenomenon that acts like a filter over our perception, changing how we measure excitement and joy. There is a concept that drifts through conversations about modern psychology and biology, a term that helps explain this feeling without judging it, known as supernormal stimuli. And while it sounds technical, it is actually a very simple way of understanding why the ordinary world can sometimes feel so difficult to engage with. To understand why we feel this way, we have to look at the idea that our minds and our senses were built for a specific kind of environment. A world of nature where things moved at the pace of the seasons, where rewards were hard-won, and where bright colors, loud sounds, and intense sweetness were rare, and signaled something very important for survival. In that original context, if you found a fruit that was incredibly sweet, it was a rare prize. Or if you saw a flash of bright movement, it meant prey or danger. And your brain was designed to lock onto these intense signals, because they were the exceptions in a mostly quiet, green and brown world. But what happens when the environment changes, and those rare, intense signals become the baseline? There is a famous observation from the mid-20th century involving birds, specifically the instinct to protect eggs, where researchers found that if they presented a bird with an artificial egg that was larger, brighter, and more speckled than its own real eggs, the bird would ignore its own offspring and obsessively tend to the fake one, even if the fake one was ridiculously large. Because the bird's instincts were not programmed to recognize reality, they were programmed to recognize the features that signaled egg, and the fake one simply had more of those features, essentially hijacking the bird's natural drive by offering a stimulus that was supernormal, better than nature, louder than nature, and more intense than the real thing. This is the part many people don't realize when they look at their own lives and wonder why they feel restless or bored. Because in a very similar way, humans have spent the last few decades building an environment full of our own supernormal stimuli, designing experiences that are brighter, sweeter, faster, and more rewarding than anything nature ever intended us to encounter. When we scroll through a feed of short videos, we are not just looking at pictures. We are seeing a curated stream of the most interesting, beautiful, or shocking moments from around the world, stripped of all the boring context, delivered one after another in rapid succession, which creates a density of stimulation that real life simply cannot match. A conversation with a friend in the real world has pauses, it has awkward moments, it has misunderstandings, and it requires patience. Whereas a digital interaction can be edited, optimized, and instant, giving us the feeling of connection without the friction of reality. When we play a video game, we are entering a world where effort is perfectly linked to reward, where there is always a clear goal, a progress bar, and a burst of sound and light when we succeed, which is a stark contrast to real work or real hobbies, where progress is often invisible, goals are ambiguous, and no one applauds when you finish a difficult task. It is easy to see how this contrast begins to reshape our expectations, not because we are lazy or ungrateful, but because our internal systems are calibrating themselves to the loudest signal in the room. If you spend hours in a world where everything is neon and exciting, and then you step back into a world that is beige and slow, the beige world is going to feel almost invisible by comparison. This is often where people start to blame themselves, thinking that they have lost their passion or that they are becoming boring people, when in reality they are simply experiencing the inevitable come down. of a sensory system that has been running on high alert. It can feel like walking into a dimly lit room after staring directly at the sun. For a while, you can't see anything at all, not because the room is empty, but because your eyes haven't adjusted to the subtle light. This adjustment period is what we often label as boredom. But if we look closer, it is really just a gap in intensity. Many people notice this when they try to sit down and read a book after spending time online, and they find that their eyes keep sliding off the page, or they feel a physical itch to get up and do something else. Not because the book is bad, but because the book demands a different kind of attention. A slower, active attention where you have to build the images in your head. Unlike the passive, rapid-fire attention that screens provide. The book is the real egg, it is nutritious, it is real, and it has depth. But the screen is the giant, speckled artificial that our instincts are screaming at us to choose because it looks so much more promising. It is important to approach this realization with compassion, because we are not fighting against a personal defect. We are navigating an environment that is engineered to be more interesting than reality. The modern world is filled with supernormal versions of everything. We have food that is sweeter and saltier than any natural ingredient. We have news that is more terrifying and dramatic than our actual daily lives. And we have entertainment that is faster and funnier than our real conversations. Over time, this constant exposure can create a kind of sensory inflation, where the cost of getting us interested goes up, and ordinary experiences can no longer afford the price. We might find ourselves feeling impatient with a sunset because it doesn't change fast enough, or zoning out during a family dinner because the pacing feels slow. And this is the part that can feel quiet heartbreaking, because we know logically that these are the moments that make up a life. Yet emotionally, they feel like they are slipping through our fingers, overshadowed by the artificial brightness of the supernormal. Some find themselves feeling a low-level sense of dissatisfaction, a feeling that life should be more cinematic or more exciting, because we have grown used to narratives that cut out the dull parts. But life is mostly made of the dull parts, the commuting, the waiting, the cleaning, the quiet evenings. And when we lose our taste for those moments, we lose our connection to the texture of existence itself. However, acknowledging this dynamic changes how we interpret that boredom. Instead of seeing the flatness of real life as a problem to be solved with more stimulation, we can start to see it as a signal that our baseline has shifted. It is a sign that we have been listening to music at maximum volume. So of course the silence feels deafening. It's increasingly experienced as a form of sensory fatigue, where the brain, having been flooded with dopamine and novelty, essentially protects itself by numbing its receptors, making it harder to feel the subtle joys of the everyday. This is why the first few moments of stepping away from supernormal stimuli can feel so uncomfortable, almost like a withdrawal. Because the noise stops but the sensitivity hasn't returned yet. You are left in the gap, and that gap can feel empty, lonely, and restless. But here is the hopeful part, the part that offers a gentle way forward. Without needing extreme measures or strict discipline, the human nervous system is incredibly plastic, meaning it is capable of recalibration. Just as our eyes eventually adjust to the dark room, allowing us to see the shapes of the furniture and the details on the walls, our minds can adjust to the slower pace of reality, provided we give them the time to settle. It's not about cutting out all the fun or living like a monk. It's about recognizing that when real life feels boring, it is usually a trick of contrast. When people allow themselves to sit with that boredom, rather than immediately trying to fix it with a phone or a snack, something interesting often begins to happen after the initial discomfort passes. The resolution of the world starts to sharpen. A walk outside, which might have felt pointless an hour ago, suddenly reveals the sound of wind in the trees or the way the light hits the pavement. A conversation, which might have seemed too slow, begins to reveal layers of emotion and connection that you miss when you are rushing to the next point. The flavor returns to the apple. It is a slow process, and it requires a certain amount of faith that the feeling of boredom is not a permanent state but a transition tunnel. We often fear that if we stop stimulating ourselves, we will be left with nothing. But in truth, we are left with ourselves and with the world as it actually is. which is often richer, more complex, and more deeply satisfying than the high-gloss version we see on screens. We begin to realize that the boring parts of life are actually where the friction of living happens. And that friction, the resistance of learning a new skill, the awkwardness of vulnerability, the silence of solitude, is what makes us feel solid and real. Supernormal stimuli offer us a life without friction, a smooth, gliding existence of constant reward. But a life without friction is also a life without traction. We can slide through days and weeks without ever really grabbing onto anything. Reclaiming the ability to enjoy the ordinary is not about forcing yourself to like things that are dull. It is about lowering the noise floor so that the quiet things can be heard again. It is about understanding that your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do, seeking the strongest signal. And that in a world of artificial signals, you have to gently, consciously guide it back to the natural ones. It can feel helpful to simply notice the contrast without judging it. To say to yourself, "This feels boring right now because I was just doing something incredibly fast." And that simple acknowledgement takes the shame out of the feeling. You aren't broken for finding a lecture boring after playing a video game. You are just calibrated to a different speed. The invitation here is to practice staying in the low stimulation zones for just a little longer than is comfortable, to stretch that tolerance muscle, and to trust that your interest will eventually naturally align with what is in front of you. It is about remembering that real joy is often a quiet sensation, a warm feeling of contentment rather than a sharp spike of excitement. As we slowly peel back the layers of supernormal stimulation, we might find that the world hasn't actually lost its magic. It's just that the magic of the real world is subtle, and it requires us to lean in to see it, whereas the artificial world leans out to grab us. By understanding this, we can stop chasing the dragon of constant novelty and start finding a deeper, more sustainable satisfaction in the things that are already here. We can learn to appreciate the egg that is real, acknowledging that while it may not be as bright or as big as the fake one, it is the only one that contains life. So, as you move through your day and you feel that familiar drop, that grayness when the entertainment stops, try to view it not as an emptiness but as a resetting. A quiet moment where your senses are taking a breath, preparing to taste the world again as it truly is. Real life didn't become boring, it just stopped shouting at you. And in that silence, there is a tremendous amount of peace waiting to be found, if you are willing to wait for your eyes to adjust. If this reflection resonated with you, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for being here.